first time I've been in Prescott. I was in Ellsworth a couple of years ago for a presentation at their library, which is in an old theater, which is really, really neat downtown. I'll just say very little about myself. I'm a professor at the UW-Madison, but please call me Mark. In the discussion, we'll have a Q&A afterward. I'm in a lot of different units. I'm mainly in the German program, which is part of languages. It's German, Nordic, and Slavic, so we got the Germanic languages and the Slavic languages in there. I'm a linguist by training, and my main area of personal activity and professional research is actually the Pennsylvania Dutch language, which despite its name is actually closely related to German. I actually have a book on the topic that I see Danielle has displayed on our table over there, so you can check it out from the library too. For those of you that are kind of curious about the language side of the Amish, this is the language that they speak. I'll be giving you a little sample, reading something and presenting something in Pennsylvania Dutch, and something that you could follow along, just to see what Pennsylvania Dutch looks like. Because the Amish are the main speakers of Pennsylvania Dutch today. I'm also in the Religious Studies program, and I teach a course on the Amish, which is fairly popular. There's a lot of curiosity about the Amish among Wisconsin students. As a matter of fact, I'm also personally a Mennonite. Our church is very closely related to the Amish historically. In fact, our basic faith is pretty much the same as just kind of lifestyle differences. And I'll be talking about that because in order to really understand who the Amish are, we have to understand the historical background and particularly religious history. And if you're familiar with Reformation history and you were kind of awake last year, you realize that last year was a relatively big year. It's the 500th anniversary of Martin Luther and his famous 95 Theses in the church door in Wittenberg, Germany. I also direct the Max Kade Institute for German American Studies. This is a unit that's within the university. What we do is we're sort of like a department, except we don't offer classes. What we do is we promote research on anything having to do with German American history, culture, language. Obviously in Wisconsin, we're in a pretty good place to have some interest in German. We're on the buckle of the German belt, as it were. And in addition to promoting research, we actually go on the road and do outreach presentations. And I am particularly passionate about getting out of Madison into communities across the state and getting to know the state a little bit better and sharing some of the stuff that we're doing on the Madison campus. I'm going to be speaking for about 45 minutes or so, no more than that, and I want to open things up for questions afterward. The topic of who the Amish are is so broad that there's no way that I can anticipate every single question that comes up. And in fact, every time that I do a presentation about the Amish, the Q&A is always unique. In other words, there's some questions that are sort of similar, but people often have, the discussion kind of goes into interesting directions. So I want to make sure that at the end that you have the opportunity to ask whatever questions you have, and I'd be happy to answer them. A lot of what I'm going to be doing is sort of dispelling stereotypes about the Amish, and we need to go back, not necessarily 500 years to the Reformation, but we do need to go back, let's start, about 55 years ago. It was in fact 55 years ago this year, in 1963, that the first scholarly book about the Amish was published. And the book is still in print today in its 4th edition. It's called Amish Society. There have been a lot of things that have been written about the Amish going back to about the Civil War, so about 100 years before that. But as I say, Amish Society was the first book to sort of take a sober, scholarly, objective take on who the Amish were. It was written by a man named John Hostetler, who himself grew up in an Amish family and made a decision as a young adult to join a Mennonite church. Mennonites and Amish are very closely related, as we'll get into more detail. On the dust jacket of his book was this image. And 55 years ago, this image kind of reflected, I think, a lot of outsiders' stereotypes about the Amish. Black and white, stern, patriarchal, not looking like they would have a whole lot of fun, right? And in fact, when people think of religious minority groups, especially conservative religious minority groups in a sort of visible way, a lot of negative stereotypes emerge, right? We think of sort of, this is a country that is premised on the idea that there should be freedom of religion, and sure enough, there's an incredible diversity of religious expressions in this country, which is fantastic, and it's part of the reason why the Amish are able to thrive in this country historically. There are only Amish in the United States and Canada, which is kind of an interesting thing. But at the same time, there are certain limits that religious expressions are sort of set to. In other words, if it goes a little bit too far from a kind of implied mainstream, then people think, oh, it's a little bit weird. And so a lot of stereotypes, the Amish are very, very familiar nationwide and in fact worldwide, but a lot of what is sort of popularly believed about the Amish often has a little bit of a critical tone, or in some cases negative, and some other cases a little bit harsh. So anyway, this image I think evokes very, very nicely the sort of popular image of the Amish 55 years ago. Let's move the clock ahead to the 21st century. Now, yeah, you're shaking your head. Thank you for shaking your head. A lot of younger people, and people sort of in the kind of middle age range, may have seen so-called reality TV shows. And I'm saying so-called with major quotation marks around the word reality, right? Reality TV shows are this kind of genre of television or entertainment that you find on cable stations for the most part, like the History Channel, Discovery Channel, Learning Channel, for example, here, that portray real people doing very unreal things. This is all really staged, and in some cases, most of it is just basically kind of silly entertainment, but in other cases it really goes over the line to being pretty tasteless. The two most famous ones that deal with the Amish, and again here we're dealing with something that's in color, and notice that we don't see sort of grumpy old people, we see sort of, attractive younger people. And today there's an incredible fascination that outsiders have among Amish youth. And there's this idea that Amish youth are just sort of chomping at the bit to sow their wild oats and go wild and smoke cigarettes and drink beer and ride around and maybe come back to the fold or not. The program Amish Mafia is the most popular and it's the most problematic. Notice the guy in the far right of that image is carrying a sawed-off shotgun, right? The premise of this show, which is set in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, which is one of the oldest and largest Amish settlements in the world, the premise of the show is that there's this kind of vigilante, posse-like group of young people who are out to kind of defend their homies, right, among the Amish in rural Lancaster County, and pretty much by any means necessary. Now, what's really problematic about this is that the Amish church, Mennonite churches, our related churches, we are all peace churches, actually, like the Quakers. In other words, we're not only pacifists, we're actually non-resistant, which means that we don't meet violence with violence under any circumstances. So it's the absolute opposite of toting a sawed-off shotgun to defend our own. So it's really, really misleading. And in fact, you could say almost insulting there. So where's the truth? Well, the truth is a little bit hard to find in the popular media. I was just chatting with Danielle about this before. There's a lot of interest in the Amish. When you go to libraries, and librarians will say, oh yeah, people check out books on the Amish. Most of what people read are books like on the upper right there, which is romance novels. You may have heard the term bodice ripper for Harlequin romances. Okay, in the Amish literature, they're known as bonnet rippers. And this is a genre of Christian fiction that's developed only within about the last 15 years. But the number of titles that appear, new titles that appear every year is exploding, right? The demand for Amish-themed romance novels is just off the charts. Now, these are novels that are romance novels, but they're chaste, right? They're clean, so they're the kind of thing that you could sell like on a Walmart bookshelf or at a Christian bookstore, for example. But if you were to sort of form opinions about a group of people, right, an ethnic group or a cultural group or whatever, purely on the basis of romance novels set against them, it would come off a lot more interesting than everyday life is. So it's polite, but it's not necessarily going to give you an accurate view of what everyday Amish life is like. If you are inclined to read Amish-themed fiction, I can give you a tip. There's a woman named Linda Byler, B-Y-L-E-R. Linda Byler, who herself is an Amish woman who writes romance novels and historical novels. She's the only Amish person that actually writes this Amish-themed fiction. There are other titles that are good. I think that Beverly Lewis is quite good as well, but I highly recommend Linda Byler. So that's a little tip if you're interested in Amish-themed fiction. Now, most of the images that you get out there that are sort of attempting to put a documentary spin on the Amish are things that focus on the sort of seamy underbelly of the Amish. So again, it's a little bit like the reality shows where you're talking about real people but set in very, very unrealistic situations. So again, Devil's Playground was one of the earliest so-called documentaries. It focuses on 4 young people who are ostensibly Amish, in fact are not Amish, right? They're young people that grew up in Amish families that had no intention whatsoever of joining the Amish church. One, in fact, actually does join the Amish, but the rest of the other ones do not join. And there were ones that were, part of a small, very small minority of Amish that make the decision not to eventually join the Amish church as young adults. You're not born Amish, the same way that you're actually not born Christian. We'll talk about that in a moment. So these were real stories, but they were very unrealistic. How many of you have been to the UW-Madison campus? Anybody been to the Madison campus? Okay, right off of campus is a street called Langdon Street, which is our fraternity row. Now, fraternities, sororities, I don't have to say too much. If I were to take a video camera and walk down Langdon Street on a warm Friday night at about 10 o'clock and just let the camera run, you'd see a lot of kind of silly stuff and some not so nice stuff that's going on. If I were to take that footage and turn it into an hour-and-a-half long documentary and say, this is UW-Madison undergraduate student life, you'd say, well, it's true, but it's not representative, right? And that's pretty much how some of these documentaries are. Shunning is another thing that's it's discussed, but very, very distorted. We can talk about that in the discussion if you're curious, but it's very misleading. Now, where's the reality? Somewhere in the middle. This is an image that's also taken from a book that I see that Danielle actually has on the shelf, on the table over there. It's the first edition. This is the second edition here, the first edition there. The name of the book is The Riddle of Amish Culture. And this book was written by a man named Donald Craybill, who recently retired as a professor at Elizabethtown College, which is a Brethren, which is a similar church to the Mennonites and Amish, a Brethren college that's in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. And Don chose, he said that the Amish are a paradox. They are a riddle to outsiders. A lot of people say, well, wait, I thought they're not supposed to ride in cars, and yet I saw a whole van load unloading at the Walmart the other day. And they're not supposed to have phones, and I saw a Amish carpenter whip out his cell phone, right? A lot of things having to do with technology, which we need to discuss. We need to clarify those things. But this idea that somehow the Amish are kind of frozen in time, but not sort of thing, it's a paradox. And so he chose this image, which was not staged. The young women that were photographed here were in fact not aware that they were being photographed. This was also in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and this evokes very nicely the paradox. From about the thighs up, you say, oh, okay, Amish. And then from about the thighs, calves down, you say, whoa, that doesn't look like Amish, right? Well, and people say, well, I thought they were not supposed to have modern technology and modern things. The Amish are not frozen in time. There's no way that the Amish would be able to thrive anywhere in the world if they were frozen in time. So the Amish today, in many respects, especially with regard to technology, and even to a certain extent with dress, right, are different from their grandparents of 2 generations ago. And if you go back even farther, a couple hundred years ago, or 250 years ago, when the first Amish came to North America, there are huge differences. But there are some things that are unchanging in the 300 plus year of the Amish, and that has to do how they understand their faith. That's something where they're not going to compromise. And so we'll talk about that too. So rollerblades, nothing wrong with them. Very, very practical in many ways. Get some good exercise. It's very convenient going down sort of small blacktop roads in rural Lancaster County. So this image, I think, does a good job of kind of evoking that paradox. And what we're going to be doing is hopefully clarifying a lot of these riddles that people have about the Amish. A couple of other books that I noticed that Daniel put out there too that I highly recommend. This book here by the man Donald Craybill, you see his name on both there. That's the book The Amish, which was a companion volume to an excellent documentary, a DVD that Danielle also has over there, which are available at most public libraries. It's sometimes replayed on public television. It appeared about 3.5 years ago on The American Experience, which is a PBS show. This was a documentary that had the complete cooperation of Amish people. There are no photographs of Amish people speaking directly into a camera, no recordings of them, but they allowed their voices to be recorded. And the Amish were very impressed with the producer and the person that was the director, the person that was putting this project together. And so it's basically the Amish telling their own story, so getting it in their own words. So a few talking heads interspersed there, including Don Craybill and colleagues, but basically it's an excellent piece of documentary filmmaking, and it has the imprimatur of the Amish, and it's also just beautifully aesthetically. It's just a beautiful documentary. It's a lot of extended periods of silence, lots and lots of beautiful nature scenes, highly recommended, and then the companion volume that goes with that. The Amish Way is also a very, very good book. One of the nice things about a lot of the books, scholarly books about the Amish, is that they're written almost like fiction. In other words, they're written in a way that's very accessible to non-specialists in, say, anthropology, sociology, or religious history. In my course on the Amish, this is one of 2 books that I use as a textbook for the students. What I like about it, you can see the subtitle of the Amish Way. The subtitle is Patient Faith in a Perilous World. And that's really, really important because the Amish don't make any sense at all unless you understand where they're coming from with their faith. A lot of people think of it in terms of buggies and no electricity and maybe organic farming, these kinds of things, but it makes no sense unless you understand the spiritual core. So that's where we need to start. We have to recognize that the Amish are not an ethnic group. They are not a particular subclass of society that's defined on their relationship to technology. It is a branch of the Christian family of churches. And the basic tenets, I mean, there's an incredible amount of diversity among Christian churches. In fact, we were talking about Lutheranism before. I mean, it's like the list of different Lutheran groups just in the upper Midwest is pretty staggering, right? So, but there's a certain kind of core that unites all Christians together. And the Amish branch on the family tree of Christian churches is fairly close to, we would say, sort of mainstream Christianity, especially the Protestant branch of Christianity. So we'll need to talk a little bit about that historically. I mentioned that last year was a relatively big year in church history, Western church history. It was the 500th anniversary of a very important symbolic act in the fall of 1517 when Martin Luther nailed the so-called 95 Theses, which were kind of points of criticism between him and directed at the Roman Church at the time. That was not the beginning of what was known as the Reformation. There were reformers going back even about at least 100 years before that. But that was an important kind of symbolic act, right? So a little bit like the Battle of Bunker Hill is to the American Revolution. The Amish, Mennonites, Brethren, Hutterites, I'll talk about these other groups in a moment, we're all part of what's known as the Anabaptist family of churches. So Anabaptist is the key word here. Our church is descended from something that sounds a little bit scary, but when you hear what was, what our spiritual ancestors preached, it's not particularly radical. They're known as the radical reformers because our spiritual ancestors went a little bit farther than people like Martin Luther, John Calvin, Ulrich Zwingli, Jan Hus, sort of early reformers, right, who had preached a kind of renewal, but the radical reformers went a few steps farther. From the perspective of being a Christian in the 21st century in the United States of America, it doesn't seem radical at all. And in fact, a lot of Anabaptist practices are shared by many other churches worldwide, including the United States. I mentioned the names Mennonites as well as Amish. Basically, the shorthand is that the Mennonites are the older of the 2 major branches of the Anabaptist family of churches. The name Mennonite comes from an early Mennonite leader or Anabaptist leader. His name was Menno Simons. So his followers were known as the Mennonites. And he was a direct contemporary of Martin Luther. He lived at pretty much exactly the same years, died almost within a few years apart of one another as well. To my knowledge, they never met, but they were familiar with one another. Both had been Catholic monks and had left the Roman Catholic Church and had very large followings. Menno was sort of well known among Anabaptist history because he was one of the very, very few early Anabaptist leaders that lived long enough to die a natural death. Basically, one thing that the early Anabaptists experienced was an incredible amount of persecution, such that virtually all the leaders were killed. And a lot of other just sort of folks, people that were committed to the reforming path. Because they fell afoul of authorities pretty much everywhere, and authorities were either going to be Catholic or they were going to be Lutheran and Reformed. And church and state were like that in those days, and so there were a lot of political leaders that were looking at religious dissenters as heretics, as seditious, and so they were out to get them. About 150 years after Menno Simons lived, there was a small group of Swiss Mennonites who identified themselves just simply as the Swiss Brethren, that felt that it was important to be a little bit more conservative and to sort of uphold the original ideals of the Radical Reformation, which I'll talk about in a moment in detail, a little bit more closely. And so his followers his name was Jacob Ammann, Aman is a fairly common Swiss name, and his followers were known as the Amish, right? It was originally just a handful of families. And in fact, the number of Amish that originally came to the United States, or the colonies in the 18th century, numbered about 300, right? And there are about 330,000 Amish today. So, but one thing that's sort of important is that the Amish population, we'll just skip ahead to that point and then get back to the fourth point there. The Amish population, about 350,000 today, is doubling every 20 years. There is no group of human beings anywhere on planet Earth that's growing as rapidly as the Amish in the United States and Canada. There's no country with a higher birth rate. There's no ethnic group within a country anywhere that has a higher birth rate. They have an average of 7 children per family and a very, very low infant mortality rate. A life expectancy that's just slightly higher than the US average. That's always been quite high, but the rest of America sort of caught up to them. They have a 90% retention rate, which means that about 90% of children that are born to Amish parents will make the decision as a young adult to formally join the Amish church. That's a very, very high retention rate, right? And so their population is doubling every 20 years. So you double 300, 350 people, it's not that much. You double 350,000, you're getting up towards 750,000. So it's a pretty amazing fact, just like this group that started off so small. I mean, they have the good fortune in living in a country that has religious freedom and a country that has a good infrastructure as far as healthcare. So women are having a lot of babies, and most of those babies are surviving, and most of the moms are surviving too. So there are plenty of other places where women are giving birth, but many of those children are not surviving, or the moms. In Wisconsin, we have position 4 of the 31 states that have Amish. Wisconsin is at number 4. Number 1, what would you guess?
Pennsylvania.
Everybody guesses Pennsylvania. That's number 2. What do you think number 1 is?
Ohio.
Ohio. That's why I asked the questions. Ohio's number 1. Pennsylvania's 2. 3?
Iowa.
Indiana. Yep. And very close behind us, number 5 is New York, upstate New York. Yeah, not New York City, upstate New York. Illinois has some too, but basically the Amish are kind of in the same sort of as the German belt. The Amish are as far north as Maine, and then into Canada. There are 3 provinces, including Prince Edward Island. And if you've ever been to Sarasota, Florida, that's the only urban Amish community. It's basically started off as Amish snowbirds. It's now, they want to get out of the cold north as well. And so what started as just a winter community is actually all year round. So if you go to Sarasota, you'll see a lot of Amish there. They don't ride horse and buggy there because it's really unhandy in Sarasota traffic, but they do have scooters, and like the older folks have big like electric trikes, those tricycles, big ones. Now, there's not one kind of Amish. There's about 40 different, what we say, affiliations among the Amish. Most people, when they think of the Amish, they think of horse and buggy and no electricity. That is the most familiar group of Amish, and they are also the largest. But even within the horse and buggy Amish, 40 different groups. So there's a lot of diversity. From those that are very, very conservative, mainly in terms of technology, to those that are more progressive. And in Wisconsin, we actually have this sort of real spectrum from the most conservative Amish anywhere, not only in Wisconsin, but also in Wisconsin, to those that actually farm with tractors, which is sort of down in our area in Madison. So it's kind of a nice sort of, as I say, microcosm of the diversity here. The formal name of the Amish that drive horse and buggy are known as Old Order Amish. There are also Mennonite groups. We're much smaller in the state, but there's also a diversity in Clark County, so like the little communities of Thorpe and Withy. That's home to a fairly large Old Order Mennonite community, and they also have horse and buggy. Unlike the Amish, they do have electricity in their homes, but they don't have TVs or computers. There's also some older Mennonites, just if you follow down to like toward Platteville in southwestern Wisconsin. There's some older Mennonites there too, as well as Amish. Now here's just an image of Menno Simons. I'll say he was a close contemporary of Martin Luther, born in 1496, so 13 years after Martin Luther, but they lived at the same time. He was from the Netherlands, and actually is a part within the Netherlands known as Friesland, so the Frisian area. So he spoke Frisian, Dutch, Latin, German. He was a prolific guy. He's well known among Mennonites and Amish because he left a very, very large body of theological writings. Now, in our churches, we don't have what we say, a communion of saints. In other words, we don't, have regard certain individuals as having a kind of privileged place in church history. But Menno Simons has a place of respect. His writings are not considered holy writ. I mean, for us, it's just the Bible. But it's very important in terms of elucidations of the faith. This is a very, very general, simplified model of Anabaptist churches today. So I mentioned Mennonites and Amish are the two most familiar. Two other groups that are a little bit less familiar, also one of which is represented in Wisconsin, so-called Churches of the Brethren, also known as German Baptists. Baptist basically meaning is any church that uses the term Baptist in its name usually means that they have full immersion baptism, right, as opposed to just sprinkling, right? So there are German Baptist Brethren here in Wisconsin, also down just south of here in the southwestern corner of the state. And the Hutterites, they're not in Wisconsin, but they are over in Minnesota. And that's the farthest east that they are. Hutterites are a communal society, and they're mainly in the United States in the Dakotas, North and South Dakota, Montana, and then go over the Canadian border to the prairie provinces of Canada. For a long time, the Hutterites had the record of being the fastest growing population on the planet because they had an average of 10 children per family. Average of 10 children per family. They've ratcheted it down a little bit, so they're now just at 7, where the Amish are. So what are the core aspects of the faith that Mennonites, Amish, Brethren, and Hutterites adhere to? Front and center is what we refer to as believer's baptism, also known as adult baptism. The idea is that to enter into a covenant with God in the company of other like-minded people, this should be a decision that you make freely yourself. You should go into this covenant with your eyes wide open. It's not a decision that somebody should make for you. Now, we won't get into too much theology, but part of the reason why some churches, and most churches actually practice infant baptism, is a doctrine known as original sin, right? The idea that there needs to be some sort of cleansing immediately to mark that. Our churches we accept the doctrine of original sin, but we interpret it differently. We understand children up to an age that's not clearly defined, we say the age of reason, but we understand children as being innocent, as not being capable of sinning. They can be naughty, but being naughty is different from being sinful. So our understanding is that if a child were to die, right, before that child were baptized, before the age of reason, then that child is guaranteed salvation, right, that the child will go automatically to heaven. So there's no need for for an infant to be baptized. Now, in fact, most churches have a somewhat similar understanding to entering into a covenant with God as signified by membership in a church by saying, because if you baptize an infant, the child is not automatically a full-fledged member of a church, right? There are many, many more hoops that you have to go through. Things like, for the Catholics, First Communion, and then Catechism, or we can say confirmation in many Protestant churches. You end up at pretty much the same spot at about, say, age 13. In our churches, the absolute youngest that we would baptize a person is, young person would probably be about 14, 15 years old, right? But more typically, it's kind of like high school age, right? And among the Amish and conservative, older Mennonites, it's also around about 17, 18, 19 years old. But it's everything it's baptism, it's First Communion, so then you're able to take communion, and you're a full-fledged member of the congregation, all rolled up into one. So basically, where other churches kind of take this sort of entering into a covenant sort of in a stepwise manner, our churches do it kind of in one event, in one sort of turning point event, known as believer's baptism. Again, sort of think, this was a radical notion 500 years ago, because church and state, the second point here too, were inextricably linked with one another. And a lot of things that the states were doing were not particularly religious, or very spiritually minded, right? And one way of kind of keeping track of citizens, right, in political places like Switzerland and Germany and France and so forth, was to make sure, have very precise senses of how many children families had. In order to record the number of children per family and populations in certain areas, you did that through church rolls. In other words, through baptismal records. And this was a way of kind of keeping tabs on people for taxation purposes, and then for men for conscription purposes, for military service. So when you have a group of people that are saying, we're not baptizing our kids, it's basically like saying, I'm going off the grid. right, 500 years ago. And when you say going off the grid today, right, politically, let's say somebody said, we're not going to have social security numbers. We are not going to pay taxes. We are not going to send our kids to the public schools. We're going to do everything homeschooled, right? Not even to say parochial schools. Then you can sort of send, and this was not a particularly warm, fuzzy time in human history. And so you can see that they are viewed as radical, right? The term radical was applied to them. Now, separation of church and state was something they said, you know, states are ordained by God in the sense that there has to be sort of secular order, but let's just keep them separate from one another. It's a doctrine that we still adhere to today. It was known as the Two Kingdoms Doctrine. You have the kingdom of God, and you have the kingdom of the world. We have to be good citizens. We have to obey laws. We have to pay our taxes, right? But in return, our spiritual lives should be free of outside meddling, right? In other words, states, authorities, establishment, the man, has no right to tell us how we should practice our faith, right? Now, this is, you know, we're kind of nodding. This is something that's part of the, woven into the fabric of American culture, political culture, right? It's part of our Constitution. That was very, very radical in the 18th century. There was no other country in the world that was preaching a separation of church and state, right, in the way that was enshrined in the American Constitution. Third point, and this was also something that really raised the hackles 500 years ago and still is problematic for a lot of outside authorities, is our doctrine of non-resistance, which is pacifism 2.0. It's not only that we don't take up arms in military, in militias or in armies, but it's also that we don't meet violence with violence. So the question is, let's say somebody attacks us physically or even emotionally, we are called not to fight back. And this is basically taking Jesus' injunctions, especially the Sermon on the Mount, right? And the idea that you should, in the face of violence and evil, turn the other cheek, right? This is how we feel, this is what we feel we are called to do. Now, in times of war, when Amish and Mennonite and Quaker and Brethren and so forth, Quaker is very similar in this respect, have been called up, typically what they've said is, I will do some sort of other service for my neighbors, like working in a hospital or on a farm or in a mental hospital, that kind of thing. I just won't fire a weapon. I just won't join the military. And so this form of alternate service, serving as conscientious objectors, which only was officially part of, recognized by the US government after the Korean War. So it's going back to the 1950s. So there are people that were professing CO status before that, but basically it was really the Vietnam era that when this came up. And there were a lot of young men, Amish and Mennonite men and members of other churches that were spending 2 years working in a hospital or mental hospital or other places, doing some form of alternative service. Now, this is where, this is kind of a difference in terms of practice or lifestyle between many Anabaptist churches and other churches, is the idea that we should walk the walk 24 hours a day. So a lot of people, when they think of church or religion, they think of going to Sunday worship services and maybe something midweek and maybe some activities. The Sabbath is very, very important to us as well. Worship services are very, very important. But that's only one piece of living out one's faith. We refer to, there's a German word that's used to describe this, Nachfolge, which means literally following after. Basically, we understand our faith as something that should inform the way that we interact with our friends, family, enemies, neighbors, people that we like, people that we don't like all that much, right? Especially those that are on the kind of negative side, people that are not nice to us, people that don't like us, people that we don't necessarily like back. We are called to love in a Christian sense. We're not called to like everybody, but we are called to love our neighbors. And that's something that's you know, the Amish and many conservative Mennonite groups are not deep into theology, but if you say sort of like, okay, what is your guidepost? They say, well, it's in Scripture, right? It's not church teaching, it's not tradition, it's Scripture. So what's important? Well, Scripture is, you know, important all the way from Genesis to Revelation, but they would say the Gospels have a very, very important position because this is where the rubber met the road. In other words, this is where you have our model. You have Jesus, who was teaching lessons and was walking the walk. And so if you think about sort of the guideposts, and I mentioned the Sermon on the Mount, the Sermon on the Mount is considered an extremely important and useful touchstone for Amish and Mennonites. And second to that, the Lord's Prayer. If you really think about the Lord's Prayer, not just sort of like going through the motions, you think about that. It's a pretty amazing sort of expression, right? Spiritual expression. If you kind of break it down in some ways and really reflect on it, I think it leads us to some pretty cool stuff. Now, in terms of values that the Amish sort of talk about, they'll often use words that are the same in Pennsylvania Dutch and German, which is Demut, which means humility. That's what you strive toward. You strive to live a humble life, and you strive to avoid sins of pride, Hochmut. So what that means is like not shouting, not being pushy, not interrupting, not cutting ahead in line, not grabbing the best seat in the front of the van, saying, "Oh, I can wait," and sit in the back. Amish are fit very well into the Midwest because we are kind of on that sort of humble side relative to maybe some other groups and other sort of regions of the country. We tend to be a little bit more kind of Scandinavian in some ways. I'm Norwegian on my mom's side, I'm from Minnesota originally, and sort of like hugging is kind of like that. It's just, it kind of fits. So it's sort of that low-key sort of thing, which we would, be expressions of humility. And then the last point is the feeling that it's probably, the folks that are trying to uphold these principles of really living out one's faith 24 hours a day, that you're probably going to be a minority in the larger society. So the Amish will say, perfect example is Christmas. A lot of people observe Christmas, recognize Christmas, scream about Christmas, defend Christmas against supposed attackers. But how is Christmas actually practiced? Well, let's think about it. What used to be known as Black Friday, right, the day after Thanksgiving, is now sort of morphed into like a charcoal gray Thursday, right, when Kohl's and Target and Best Buy and stuff are opening like at 6 or 7 p.m. on Thursday evening. All the materialism, all the go, 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 rush, 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 we know all that, right? We get caught up in that, right? These are things that they say, okay, maybe we should do something that's a little bit out of step, a little bit nonconformist. And so the Amish don't have big celebrations at Christmas. Christmas is important, but it's very, very low key. Easter is a much bigger holiday in many ways because they see much more of a scriptural basis than like trees and lights and cookies and all these other things. But especially banging down the doors of Best Buy at 7 o'clock on Thanksgiving evening. Now, so there's a sense of like you're always going to be a little bit nonconformist. By being a non-resistant pacifist, you're going to be nonconformist. The Amish choose to mark their nonconformity in a more overt way than, so they could say, more progressive or modern Mennonite groups. So that means grooming oneself differently, dressing differently, limiting technology, we'll talk about that right now, and then maintaining a language that is also rather unique. Now, it's a little bit like, I'm not seeing anybody that has a UW or team color. Actually, you've got from your school, I see the Crusaders, okay. You're wearing a really neat hoodie, right, that is associated with your school, right? Okay. And the reason, I'm not going to put her on the spot and tell her why she's wearing it, but ask her why, but she's doing it because that's her school and she feels a certain amount of contentment that that's where she goes to school, right? She feels good about it. It's a network that she belongs to. She's got her friends there. She likes her teachers. It's going to, give her a good basis in life. And we identify outwardly our affiliations with groups. This is why we wear uniforms in the workplace or in the military and so forth. When we wear robes, when we sing in choirs, right? I mean, uniforms perform that function. Basically, the Amish are wearing uniforms all the time. That basically, instead of like green and gold and a big G on it, we'll just sort of say, basically, I'm on the Amish team. I have a buddy at our Mennonite church who was wearing a green and gold once. And I said, Matthew, why are you wearing that to church? And he said, well, G stands for God today. So now this faith that has, that the Amish are incredibly grateful that they live in the United States of America, which is a place where they're, it's really sort of an ideal, if you have to pick a country to live in, to practice one's faith that's a little bit outside of the mainstream, relatively speaking, you're pretty well off here in the United States of America. The Amish are very aware, though, of their past persecution, and I mentioned that all the early Anabaptist leaders were basically martyred, except for Menno Simons. One particularly powerful story is about a Dutch Mennonite man who's represented here in this image. It's a very, very famous image. His name was Dirk Williams, and he was a Dutch Anabaptist leader who was a contemporary of Menno Simons. He was, like many Anabaptist leaders of the time in the 16th century, imprisoned and sentenced to death for being an active preacher. Under circumstances that are not entirely clear, he was able to escape. It looked like he probably had assistance from a sympathetic jailer. He had been in prison for several weeks, I believe, had lost a fair amount of weight and was running across a marshy area that had been frozen over. And one of his pursuers, he hears a crash, right? He turns around, he sees that this jailer has fallen into the water. And so Dirk Williams stops, runs back, pulls that man out of the water and saves his life. And then the other jailers gather around him, rearrest Dirk Williams, and he's executed about 10 days later. And the moral of that story that every Amish kid knows as well is not that Dirk Williams should have kept running, but that Dirk Williams did what he was called to do, which sometimes means that you're not necessarily going to get the reward that you would hope that you would get. Now, no Amish parent in particular wants to see their child martyred. There's no sort of culture of martyrdom in saying that, extreme suffering or premature death or something that you strive for. Sadly, the most horrendous act of violence ever committed against Amish people happened right here in the United States of America about 11 years ago. This was the so-called Nickel Mines Massacre, and I won't go into much detail, but I believe that the book is also there that's written about it that Daniel put out there. There was a very, very mentally deranged man in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania that lived near a small unincorporated community called Nickel Mines, loaded with Amish around there, went into an Amish schoolhouse and sent all the boys out, sent the teacher out. There were a couple of moms there who were helping that day. One first grader who hadn't started learning English yet snuck out with the boys. There were 10 girls left. He lined them up in the front of the room and shot every single one of them execution style. 5 girls died immediately, and the other 5 were wounded. And there was one family that I know actually that had 3 girls in the school. There was one that was wounded, one that was killed, and one that was the little first grader that escaped. And it was over within 12 minutes. He committed suicide. The SWAT team from Lancaster County Sheriff's Department came. He killed himself, and it was a disturbing scene, as you can imagine. And within hours, everybody, worldwide, this was nationwide news. I'm sure many of you may remember this, the so-called Nickel Mines Amish Massacre. And immediately, obviously, the community was sort of tending to the needs of the girls that had been in there and the families in the community. But this was all about 10:30 in the morning. It was done by about 11, and by about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, a small delegation of Amish had gone to the shooter's widow at this point. They had 3 kids. She was distraught, absolutely distraught. This woman had no clue what her husband was up to. He did leave suicide notes. And they hugged her, and they said, "We forgive him. We don't hold anything against your family, and what can we do to help you?" And the shooter's father, who had very, very close Amish friends, was inconsolable, was absolutely bawling. And I mentioned before, the Amish are not particularly touchy-feely, but there were Amish elderly men who were friends of the same generation of this father who hugged him and said, "We love you, and we want to do whatever we can to support your family in this." And there were literally millions of dollars of donations that were sent from around the world to help with the medical expenses, and the girls are still experiencing some very serious consequences from that. And there was a fund that was set up that's managed by Amish stewards. And the Amish steering committee for this insisted that a portion of that be permanently dedicated to the shooter's family, the shooter's kids. And this was a very, very powerful message. This was at the height of what was known as the Bush Doctrine at the time, sort of in the wake of the 9/11 reaction. So the idea not only that we hit back when we're hit, but we hit back preemptively. So the idea of going, for example, into Iraq was the idea, it's like, well, let's get the terrorists before they have a chance to do another thing like 9/11. So this was a very, very powerful 180-degree different kind of message that was conveyed. And the popular media, by and large, got it right. But it's a very, very, see the subtitle here, How Forgiveness Transcended Tragedy. Now, sadly, we hear about shootings all the time. Like, think about Parkland. In most cases, and you will never hear this on the mainstream media, in most cases, you'll have Nickel Mines Amish families going to these places, the survivors' families, and just simply helping people to grieve and work through this. The family, for example, the couple that had 3 girls in there, one wounded, one killed, and one survived. They, in particular, they went to Sandy Hook, which was the next large sort of shooting at the elementary school in Connecticut. And just not for publicity, anything, it's just, they just say, we've gone through what you're going to go through, and we just want to do what we can to help. The Amish are very, I mean, they say this is one way that they can really take their faith and apply it in a way that's sadly necessary in American society. Schoolhouse was torn down after 10 days, and now there's just a field there. There are 10 trees there, to remember the 10 victims wounded and killed. The Amish, as I mentioned before, are big into living out one's faith. You do that in community. So there's no such thing as an Amish hermit. You just will never find that. If you grow up in a family with an average of 6 siblings, you're not going to have your own room. You probably won't have your own bed. You may not have, well, you may have your own drawer, but you won't have your own dresser. There's not a lot of private space among the Amish. Now, when young people think about this, they say, I want my own room, I want my own space, I want my own closet, and this kind of thing. Yeah, as you get older, speaking as somebody who's now, I'm 55, and I think, I want people to be in my business, I feel kind of good when people are looking out after me. Especially as Amish people age, they like the fact that there's constant activity, there's constant sort of like fun, interaction, joking around with all generations coming together. Amish people generally marry around age 20 and start having kids right away, which means that their grandparents in their middle ages, so their early 40s, they've got grandkids, which means in their 60s, their grandkids are getting married. So Amish men tend to retire relatively early compared to the US average, so around 63 is the average. They're going to be, on average, living another 20, 25 years. There's very, very practical advantages there because childcare. So there are no daycares, right? So basically, Amish elders, and they're not elderly, but they're maybe just in their 60s, are looking after their great-grandkids and maybe some of their grandkids. So a lot of activity. A lot of it centers around food. The Amish diet is the seafood diet. See it, you eat it. As long as you take 10,000 steps, right, you're in good shape, pretty much. Amish schools are also an important community institution. Until about the 1950s, most Amish kids went to regular old public schools. But that was the time in American society when the one-room schoolhouses started closing. And kids, they were consolidated, they were bussed into towns. And the Amish said, we really like these one-room schoolhouses where the kids are just sort of around the corner rather than in the town. So the vast majority of Amish kids go to these Amish schools. They're called parochial schools because they're church-run schools, but there's no religious instruction that goes there. It's purely secular matters. So there's prayers and songs, but no religious instruction goes on there. That's something that's completely separate. The curriculum is basically guided by the outside as well. But they have a lot of things like McGuffey readers and more traditional things as well. And then playing games. Amish kids are really into physical activity, and older folks too. I mentioned dress is an important sort of way of identifying. Amish dress has changed rather slowly, but it has changed. You kind of look at the Quaker Oats man on the box, and he looks kind of Amish. Well, he's Quaker, but in fact the Amish were invited by William Penn and Quakers in the Quaker state in Pennsylvania, who were kind of the Amish to England, as it were, right? A persecuted religious minority in England, guaranteed religious freedom, and so there are many aspects of Amish dress that were actually carried over from the Quakers. There are very few plain Quakers left. There's still some, but most Quakers have just simply moved away from distinctive dress. But some things are still European, but by and large, a lot of it is Quaker. Now we'll talk about technology, and this is where we'll wrap up and open things up for questions. The Amish are not frozen in time. The Amish do change, but basically the bottom line is that you have your faith. Your faith is expressed best in a supportive, loving community. So what promotes a good community life, right? That's how they look at technology. What promotes healthy community life? So let's take a look at these 3 aspects of technology. It's pretty safe to say that most people in this room have in their dwelling place at least 2 of these, maybe all 3. A dishwasher and a washer and a dryer, okay? In every single Amish home there's a washing machine. No one goes down to the creek, with a washboard or anything like that. That's one. No Amish home has a dryer, and no Amish home has a dishwasher. And you say, oh, why does that make it okay to have a washing machine? It doesn't look as nice as this front loader, I'll show you in a moment. But still they have washing. Why is that okay, but not this and not this? Well, think about the activity of washing clothes. Washing clothes is a fairly solitary activity, right? This is a typical Amish wringer washer. It's got a little Honda motor here to run it. Okay? So basically, take the clothes, you dump them in there, sort them, dump them in there, and then just set it going. The agitator spinning, running it through this, rinse them, maybe run it through one more time, and then line dry them. Okay, it's a fairly solitary activity. A dryer doesn't run very easily off of this. Okay, washing machine does. It's not hard to run a wringer washer off of this. Who doesn't like the smell of line dried laundry? You know, it's sort of an advantage. It's saving energy, and it's something that you don't need. You know, you just don't need it. It's not necessary. Washing dishes is an entirely different activity. It's not, shouldn't be, I'm telling you this, a one-person job. You can have a 4-year-old clear the table, right? Go over to the sink and then somebody, there's not much to scrape off of it, not much thing, but basically get it ready to wash. Somebody washes, somebody rinses, somebody dries, and somebody else puts away. And what are you doing that time? Just standing there? No, you're singing, you're joking, you're yakking, you're splashing water on one another, and they say, what a wonderful experience to get the family together. Amish are not only big on eating, they're big on singing. Amish are a very, very vocal, music-friendly culture. It's a lot of singing that's going on. And so you just go past, you know, like a group of people working and you hear song, right? And Amish would say, you know, it just kind of puts you in a better mood if you're singing, right? And so washing dishes, they say, what a wonderful, and people think of this as a chore, right? They think of it as sort of like, oh, I gotta wash the dishes. And they're saying, hey, let's wash the dishes because it's an excuse to get together, right? Like building a barn, like piecing together a quilt. Now what about the phone, right? The phone has been around sort of in a widespread way for almost exactly 100 years in the United States. When they came out in rural Pennsylvania, the Amish were completely on board with it. They say, what a wonderful tool. This is great for business, it's great for, you know, communicating over large distances, but they especially saw it as useful for business. And then quickly they saw, if we have a phone in our home, it's going to ring, and then somebody's going to get up from some movie from the 40s. So get up from the table and then yak, 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 yak. They say, let's have our cake and eat it too. There's a wonderful utility to the telephone, but there's a downside. It can be abused. So let's do like this, which is down in the Platteville area. Let's basically put the phone in a shanty, in the shop, in the barn, but not in the middle of your house, so that you've got it there when you need it, and you can have an answering machine. It's important for business purposes, definitely for emergencies, calling the fire department, police, or whatever, but you're not going to be tempted to just like waste too much time on it, right? And who doesn't know the challenges of limiting technology and things like the phone that I got on my, waist here too. Limiting, I was at a library actually last fall, and I walked out and I noticed that there was like a one-pager on like tips of limiting screen time for kids and phones and these kinds of things. We're dealing with these kinds of things too as non-Amish folks and like how we raise our kids. But the Amish kind of take decisions that are a little bit maybe unique. But still, it's like having your cake and eating it too. It's not saying no, it's saying yes, but. And then just to kind of wrap things up, the Amish, as I mentioned before, are not, they don't live in communes, so they live among non-Amish people. They don't live in sort of distinct communities. They strive to be good neighbors. One way of expressing their good neighborliness is by developing friendships with their neighbors. Also, like the post-nickel mines outreach of working with grieving survivors of shootings is an important aspect of that. A little bit sort of funner way of thinking about it is a program that the Amish, this is from Lancaster County again, are really big into. It's known as the Fresh Air Fund. The Fresh Air Fund was started in the mid-1800s in New York City by wealthy philanthropists who said, you know, there are a lot of kids in this really nasty, stinky city that never get any fresh air. There are not enough parks, they're just stuck in these ugly tenements. In those days, there was no such thing as vacation for average people, and there definitely was nothing like summer camp for kids. So if you were wealthy, you went out to your estate, right? But if you weren't wealthy, you were stuck in these places. And so the Fresh Air Fund, which still exists today, New York Times is one of the biggest backers of this, basically said, let's raise funds to take these kids out of the stinky city and put them on farms in the summertime. And so you'll tool around the byroads of Lancaster County in the summertime. You'll see Hispanic, Asian American, and many African American children from Philadelphia, New York, and Baltimore, and DC, who are dressed Amish, right? And those are fresh air kids, right? And there's some wonderful, it's like the kind of camp I wish I had experienced, right? So these kids are given a lot of opportunities that are similar to camp, but a lot of love, right, also from families. And so then the families end up sort of developing partnerships. So mom and dad may come out for Christmas and so forth. And so it's a really neat story about kind of reaching out to people outside of their immediate midst. A lot of people are surprised to realize that the Amish, even though they all live in rural areas, minus the folks in Sarasota, are overwhelmingly business-oriented now. So it's less than 20% of Amish families depend on farming as their main source of income. Farm crisis affected the Amish too. So they all live on small farmettes and in rural areas and will have a garden, maybe small-scale farming, but most Amish depend on businesses, small businesses, and in Wisconsin, anything having to do with wood. So furniture, home remodeling, roofing, these kinds of things, the Amish are really, really successful with that. This is taken from a sort of Menards-ish kind of business in Holmes County, Ohio. It's a lumber company ostensibly, but you can go there and say, I want to put up a pole shed. It's all Amish guys there, and they've got Bluetooth and their computers, Amos Line 3. I mean, it's an amazing sort of high-tech environment that they're very, very gifted at. And so the last thing I'm going to leave you with is the language. How many people here have had a little bit of German? We had some German. How many people here speak English? English is related to German, so you should be able to recognize this. Pennsylvania Dutch is a language that is developed from German dialects. People that know German and come from Germany don't really understand it all that well because it's been 250 years of difference. When it's written down, Amish people, and the Bible's now been completely translated to Pennsylvania Dutch as of a few years ago, when it's written down, they generally use English spelling rules. So if you kind of are familiar with how German looks, this doesn't even look German. So this is an example of a book of children's Bible stories. We're going to be hearing the very, very beginning of the creation story. So even if you don't understand German or Pennsylvania Dutch, you're familiar with the plot line. You know the story. The title of the book is Welle lesen, which means let's read. And the subtitle is Bibelstories für Kinder, Bible Stories for Children. And so we'll listen to the beginning of the creation story, narrated in how you would speak natural Pennsylvania Dutch to a child. Der Start von die Erd. Wie lang zurück hat's kein Erd gehabt, kein Leid, kein Helling. Es war alles just dunkel gewesen. Versterben hat Gott den Himmel und die Erd gemacht. Nur gesagt, lass es Licht sein. Irgendwie so war es Licht gewesen. Gott hat's Licht da geheißen und das Dunkel Nacht. Das war nur der erste Tag, als das Leben war. Den nächsten Tag hat die Wolke gemacht, auch hat die Luft gemacht, so dass man schnaufen kann. Auf den dritten Tag hat das Wasser und das Land verteilt. Hat die See und die Himmel gemacht, selber Tag. Hat noch gesagt, lass die Bäume und das Gras sterben wachsen. Und sie haben noch sterben wachsen. All right, so I'd be happy to entertain any questions that you might have.
So at what age do they learn English?
They learn English pretty much when they start school. The Amish don't have kindergarten, so they start at age 6, first grade. They'll do sort of like what they call schnuppern, which is sort of like visiting the school in the spring, or at the end of the term before they would start to visit. But basically, if you're the oldest in your family, then you probably haven't picked up much English yet. But if you're the younger ones, then you picked up a lot of English from your siblings coming back. Because this is exceptional. The vast majority of Amish kids don't read, Amish people generally read or write Pennsylvania Dutch. They speak Pennsylvania Dutch, they read and write English more actively. Amish families are big into public libraries, and so they don't have a lot of screen time, and so books are a very, very big deal. And so going to the public library, checking out books and these kinds of things, very, very important. So their literacy is in English. But actively, they start at age 6.
Okay. And can they go to college?
They generally choose not to. It's not forbidden, but the typical Amish curriculum stops at 8th grade. Some in areas where if they're required to get a high school diploma for outside employment will get a GED. There are a handful of Amish that have gone to college, but basically, in order to be an Amish person, you don't need a college degree. And there are Amish millionaires in these very successful businesses that have 8th grade diplomas, right? A lot of practical experience, a lot of apprenticeship, a lot of sort of on-the-job training. You know Jayco, the trailer factory company founded by Amish guys, 8th grade education. I knew one guy, it was J and K put together, and the Kaufman that was there. And he was a very humble guy, and I was wondering, it's like, he retired a little bit earlier, and it's like, well, he's a multimillionaire. And I lived in an Amish community in Texas, believe it or not, for many years. Before I came to the Dairyland, I was in Texas, at the University of Texas at Austin for 12 years, and I lived in an Amish community, which was great. It was like cowboy life and Amish life together. I loved it. And we had a lot of Amish snowbirds that would come down to Texas and then farther down to Mexico as well. And this guy Dave Kaufman was down there too. And somebody said, yeah, well, he was one of the guys that started JCO, and just as humble as it comes. Yes?
What were one of the views on help on medical issues?
Great question. I'm actually very involved in working with our med school and clinics to help kind of mediate between the Amish and the larger society. There are no formal limitations on medical care, but Amish are much more homeopathy, naturopathy, natural healing oriented. Women prefer to have their babies at home with midwives. 90% roughly of the babies that are born in Wisconsin are born to midwives at home, or Amish birth attendants. I do a lot of work that's involved with midwives, midwifery, and babies and so forth. There is a small birthing center that serves pretty much exclusively Amish and Mennonites at a fantastic clinic in Lafarge in Vernon County. It's just simply called the Lafarge Clinic. The guy there it's amazing. So there are a lot of natural remedies. There's a lot of lore, there's a lot of wisdom. So a lot of, sort of people, especially things having to do with pregnancy and childbirth. There's, a woman that's pregnant is going to get a lot of very, very good practical advice simply by growing up in an Amish community in ways that a lot of women that are not necessarily, young women that are pregnant, that are not necessarily getting much from elders or other community members. So they tend to be more alternative minded. They don't carry medical insurance, which means that they're paying out of pocket. They will pay their bills, but some hospitals, including our hospital, typically do, medical insurance is a scam if you never figured that out, but basically the sticker price is never what is paid, ultimately. So hospitals hope to get something like between 20 and 25% in most cases from insurance companies, right? And so what they basically do is they knock off 2/3 of the cost for the Amish. The Amish are still paying more, and this is not every hospital. Many hospitals just simply say you got to pay the full thing. But the Amish, you can, as you know, rack up huge bills very, very quickly. But then the community kicks in, and then you just take free will offerings, and you just pay the bills. So, yeah.
How about politics? Did they get involved, and if so, how?
Basically, going back to that Two Kingdoms, they sort of say, let's keep them separate. They have generally not voted in national elections. Sometimes they'll vote in local elections. They won't stand as candidates. Years ago, there were Amish on public school boards. They saw that as something that was kind of good, so they would stand for election for that, but they wouldn't serve, in high office. The last campaign, the 2016 campaign, was rather problematic for the Amish. I mean, all campaigns get a little bit nasty in terms of I will fight for you, I will, this and that, or whatever. We all know that it got pretty muddy in a lot of ways. Now, there was a PAC, a political action committee, funded by Trump supporters that was targeting Amish. And they were saying, because Ohio and Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, these are swing states, right? If we can just get these Amish people out to the polls, they can swing it. This political action committee is saying that the reason that Pennsylvania and Ohio flipped for Trump is that they got all these Amish and Mennonites to vote. It's not true. It's not true. The Amish were even more repulsed. If they were to vote by, if they were to choose a party, they would say armchair Republicans, sort of social values, conservative, fiscally conservative, but it was just a whole different ball of wax in that campaign. And they were very turned off by just the whole tenor of the debate. Let's put it that way, and so they kept their distance from that. So they say, pray for people in authority, but just keep that at bay.
Going back to their medical issues, do they immunize at all? Do they have a...
They are not part of the anti-vaxxer culture so much as that you find in a lot of other rural America. It's a family choice. This is one thing that's very interesting. Part of a study that I'm involved in through our med school is that the Amish have very, very low rates of allergies and asthma. Mm-hmm. And the reason is that they get dirty when they're kids. Mm-hmm. Their immune system is built up. This is not just a myth, this is fact.
Doctor told us when we grew up, you do dirt.
And this is why farmers, just in general, as opposed to city folk, have very, very low rates of allergy and asthma. And so there's a lot of that just kind of natural, I mean, working with nature that works out well for them. But, you know, things like polio, they're going to be on board with that, right? That's not something that it's a communicable disease. Yes?
How does taxes and stuff go into them in terms of, does the government go after them for stuff?
Like the government goes after everybody. They all have to pay their taxes.
They're off the books, you know.
No, they are very much on the books. The only sort of little exemption that they have is that if you're a self-employed Amish person, you're exempt from having Social Security taken out because they don't accept government assistance. So they won't claim Social Security.
Oh, okay.
But the thing is that there's huge numbers of Amish men and also some women that are employed by non-like companies, like factories and so forth. They have no choice. They have to have Social Security, FICA, whatever, Medicare taken out. So basically they view it as giving a gift to the government. They'll say, better that we give something to the government rather than we're taking from them. So they're actually paying more than their fair share as far as that goes. They have to pay every other single tax. The other thing that they're exempt from is the Affordable Care Act. Because they're not, well, there's no individual mandate anymore, but when there was an individual mandate, everybody had to get insurance. Then the Amish, you know, as members of a church, of churches that on religious principles do not buy insurance, they said they were exempt. The reason that the Amish don't buy insurance is they say it's profit driven. Somebody's making money off of risk. And they see this, and they basically see profit-driven hospitals as something that's also wrong, morally. They say it should be not-profit. That's just how it is. So people are making money off of the risk of other people's health.
How about birth control?
Birth control is not forbidden, but it's generally not practiced. Now, there are some families that, one question that often comes up is because they intermarry within their society, are there problems with that? Yes and no. There are about 550 to 600 hereditary diseases that have been identified in humans. The Amish are immune to the vast majority of them because they only intermarry among themselves. So most societies around the world are quote-unquote inbred. Our ancestors all were, right? Because you couldn't walk far enough away out of that valley or whatever in Norway over the hill to get away from that. Iceland is a very interesting thing. Iceland is a country that has almost exactly the same population as the Amish. They're also effectively a closed society because who moves to Iceland? Who marries Icelanders, right? They're all related to one another. And they did a study of fertility among Icelanders. They found that if you're related at a degree of third or fourth cousin, that's the best match. You have the most and the healthiest kids. If you're second cousin or first cousin, fertility goes way down, but fifth and higher also goes way down. So there's this interesting thing that nature has adapted. So basically, if you're marrying only within the community, yes, you're at risk for certain diseases, but you're also selecting for good genes, right? So it's a little bit like breeding a lot of other things, right? Except it's just sort of nature kind of taking its course. So, let's see, how did we get onto the genetic? Yes. Birth control, yeah. So there are some families that know that they may be, the parents have 2 recessive genes where there's going to be some problems. Or the chances of problems are greater. In some cases, families will choose to practice birth control. Yeah.
The early Anabaptist movement was very evangelistic, and now it doesn't seem like there's much evangelism going on. When was the change, and would you be welcomed if you wanted to join a community?
Basically, good question. Basically, the Amish and the older Mennonites don't proselytize because they say, it's so hard for you to give up, you on the outside, to give up all these things and to join us, right? It's so much easier for us to go in your direction. Now, in other, like more progressive Amish and Mennonite churches that are all English speaking, for example, there's a pretty active mission movement. There's a lot of evangelizing that's going on. But our churches tend to practice what's known as more silent witness. So like, for example, our sort of big organization that we support through our donations and directly through our help is known as Mennonite Central Committee, which is sort of a blend of mission and Red Cross. So like Haiti has been a very, very big involvement for Mennonites and Amish in terms of donating like money and then also actually sending people there. But a lot of it's sort of like digging wells and cleaning things up and building schools and that sort of thing. and witnessing, but not being particularly aggressive about our witness. But yeah, I mean, this is one thing, like for example, the Great Commission, there are some people that don't join the Old Order Amish because they feel called to witness in a more overt way. And so that is a cultural difference. So the Amish are much more sort of, silent witness, and sort of letting your light shine. As they say, let your light shine, just don't shine it in somebody else's eyes.
Would you be,
Oh, sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
would you be welcome at a church service by the Amish?
If you knew them, yeah, the Amish are a little bit cautious about media. And so they're unfortunately kind of targeted by reporters and people with recording devices and that sort of thing. So they don't want their pictures and recordings and that sort of thing kind of in the larger media. And so, but if you know families, I mean, typically there's no restriction that way. You wouldn't be able to take communion, but it's close communion. Now, in terms of joining, one thing I do want to mention about 350,000 Amish. There are probably 300 of those that were born into non-Amish families. So it's very, very small. Going back 50 to 100 years, it was much larger because the leap from being not Amish to Amish was much shorter. But if you're, I mean, it's a big, big gap. But, there's a couple that I know in Hillsborough, which is in Vernon County, eastern Vernon County. They're retired, never had kids. They're in their early 60s and they're joining the Amish. It's a very, very slow process. They don't speak German. They don't speak Pennsylvania Dutch, which is kind of a barrier. I mean, all Amish people speak English, but they use the Luther Bible, the original Luther translation of the Bible. The hymnals and songbooks are all in German, with the old Gothic lettering, and they speak Pennsylvania Dutch. So it's a little bit of a barrier for them. But
Do they have a church building, or do they go and?
generally not. Home, it's basically sort of, which is a relic of the days of persecution when they had to worship in secret. So they were worshiping in basements, barns, caves, woods, that sort of thing. But there's one exceptional group in western Pennsylvania near Pittsburgh where the Amish they use a school building as a church building. And this was, if you don't know this, that the border between Maryland and Pennsylvania is the Mason-Dixon line. So that was a big deal in the Civil War. So Gettysburg is just over that line, right? A lot of battles going on there. And at one point the Southern troops came over and they knew that Amish who were living close to the border on Sundays had a lot of food because they were all, if they're going in their home, if Amish, there you have a big meal afterward. And so these soldiers would raid, they see where all the buggies were parked, and they raid the homes, take all the food. And this was another sad story about the Confederacy. And so the Amish basically said, what we're going to do is just meet for worship and then not gather for meals afterward. Now what they do is, because the Civil War is over now, and it's safe, again, to eat communal meals, they just have maintained that tradition. And so it's basically carrying into
We own some property up in Barron County.
Oh, okay.
And there's quite a group of Mennonites up there.
Yes.
And they do have a place of worship.
Yeah, the older Mennonites have meeting houses.
Yeah.
And you'll notice that they have like big sheds around the outside too for their buggies. And then there are Mennonites up there that also have cars. So basically, the only...
Well, all of them that I've ever met up there have cars.
Okay, then they do definitely have church buildings.
Yeah.
Our church, for example, our congregation is quite small. So we rent from a Lutheran church actually in Milwaukee because our worship service starts at 4 in the afternoon. So that's like the freest time that we have. But then we get like the kitchen and the...
Boy, they're the most honest people to deal with,
Well, Amish are not, and Mennonites are not perfect, but there's, there's a...
Yeah.
I mean, Amish would say, don't put us on a pedestal, whatever kind of thing. We're humans like everybody else, but there's a kind of trust value, there's an honesty that's there.
Yeah, we bought property from some Mennonites up there.
Okay.
And it was just, a good deal, both ways, so.
Yeah, I mean, Amish feel, business dealings with Amish people are very nice, especially real estate.
So what kind of strategies are they using to deal with the intrusion of technology, and especially like the kind of technology where everything's on your phone and they've got social media, and I'm sure their youth are seeing it and experiencing it.
Yeah, I mean, it's going back to the telephone. That was the first thing, and now it's smartphones. Most communities don't allow portable phones of any kind. If they do, they'll allow the old flip phones. or you can't get internet access. So smartphones are basically pretty much off limits. Many Amish that are working in these factories, like the place I show there, they have internet access and so forth. They need it for business purposes, but they're not going to bring it home. Very interesting thing, go to ibyfax.com. And this is a company where I can send an email to an Amish person and it prints out as a fax. And I can have like a doc, a Word doc, or a PDF or something attached to it. It takes my email and then every document that's attached to it prints it out in fax form. The Amish have fax machines, and so this is one way of getting around the not having email thing. Very clever. And there are some older Mennonites and more conservative Mennonites that have computers, pointing to you because you mentioned Barron County, that have computers, but they are basically like calculators. Right? So they're things that are not hooked up to the internet, but you have like, you know, Wikipedia on a thumb drive kind of thing.
Oh.
So it's got electricity, but it's not hooked up to the internet. Yeah.
What's it like being a Mennonite at the University of Wisconsin-Madison?
Great question. Lonely sometimes. Basically, being a sort of person of faith, regardless, is not easy. We have we call UW Christian Fellowship, which is faculty, staff, and graduate students. And students have tons of organizations. But for older folks, like the faculty, staff, and graduate students, older students, we have a Bible study. We have I meet with a small group of folks for prayer once a week, and we rent a classroom and that sort of thing. So it's the kind of thing where as long as we're not sort of proselytizing. I mean, I've witnessed in a lot of ways, but in a way that I think is particularly appropriate. I'm not going to hide who I am and what I talk about. Our chancellor, Becky Blank, is a strong person of faith. So, it's like, it's possible. It's not easy. Our department recently, it's a German department, came up with a sort of a statement against white supremacy, sort of white supremacist movements and white nationalism post-Charlottesville. They say, well, a lot of these groups are sort of co-opting German and Scandinavian symbolism for racist ends, right? And so we wanted to take a stand against that sort of thing. And so, I said, well, I think it's fine to say that we, stand up against hate. And then somebody said, and then I said, and standing against violence. And they say, well, it's okay if you punch a Nazi in the nose. And I say, well, not exactly. And then people say, oh yeah, it's Mark. Yeah. And if it gets people to think about like that, maybe it's not necessarily the right thing to punch the Nazi, even a Nazi in the nose, or a Klansman or something like that. Gets people thinking.
What would be somebody's, or one of their type of reaction if, for whatever reason, they develop some kind of medical surgical condition, and then they are hooked up to an IV, they are using an MRI or X-ray, things that...
Yeah, I mean, well, you don't have MRIs or X-rays at home. That's basically only in hospitals and clinics. But, Amish elders, good question. There's some Amish elders that need oxygen, for example, and need sort of, breathing machines, and they will get electricity for that. Amish people, elders, are not sent to nursing homes or retirement communities. They're always cared for at home. And if that means that you need the electricity, you'll get it. To give you an example, in Wilton, which is sort of near Toma, there was a community I was up at, and there was a woman there who had 21 kids, none of whom she had given birth to. She had married 2 widowers, one who had 14 and one who had 7. Now remember, 21, even 14 kids, that's not 14 babies, right? Right? It's not Octo whatever mom or something. So she has lots and lots of step kids and she's in her 80s now. She's now a widow and herself. And she's had a series of strokes, and she's bedfast, right? She's in bed, and she's pretty much paralyzed. She needs 24-hour care. In shifts of 6-hour shifts, so 4 a day, you have couples coming. It could be kids, stepkids, grandkids, whatever, and anybody else. Doesn't make any difference. It has nothing to do with like direct sense. Her needs are cared for. There's no question that she will be cared for in a loving environment. She doesn't feel like she's a burden on anybody because she's just grown up with this. When children are born that have very, very extreme special needs or something like that, they're viewed as not embarrassment or a burden, but as a gift of God, just like any other child is. And actually in Cashton, which is the largest Amish community, they actually have in their network of small schools, they actually have a special school. Because it's a large enough community, there's a critical mass of some kids that have disabilities. And so they have a special school there, which basically means that, like many teachers, it's like maybe a 1-to-3 ratio rather than say 1-to-12 or something.
That sense of community is just marvelous, I think, when you feel like you got all this family and extended family.
Yeah, and especially as you get older. Like I say, it's just this feeling of like, one time I was with some horse and buggy Mennonites going to church, and as you get toward the meeting house, there's lots and lots of buggies all together, right? And we were behind the brother-in-law of my buddy who was going with, and all of a sudden I noticed that instead of pulling into the churchyard and then parking in one of the sheds, he parked at another Mennonite house that was like right in front of the church. And I was like, why is he going there? And if you need to use the bathroom, there are bathrooms at the church too. It's like, what's going on? And so he goes in there, and then we just kind of went on by, and then I said, Malin, what happened? I said, why did you go in there? He says, I forgot to shave. He said, I got to church, I realized I'd forgotten to shave, and my wife said, well, let's just stop here and you can shave. And so what he did was he walked into their kitchen, which had like a separate sink for just, kind of the traditional farm thing. He just grabbed that guy's shaving stuff and cream and shaved and then put it back, and he didn't even think that he was going to mention that to the guy. So, oh, by the way, I used your shaver, your razor or whatever like that. That kind of sort of like community feeling, which is like a lot of people go, ooh, whatever, but it's like, as I say, as you get older, there's something about that you never feel lonely. Right. You just always feel like you can walk into somebody else's house and it's okay.
Yes.
Put another plate, 3 plates, 5 plates.
You can see why their longevity is at least probably even higher than ours.
The happiness of elders is just so, they just feel so loved. And also like my grandfather was not Amish, he was a Congregationalist. My grandfather lived to be almost 91. He said, don't ever put me in a home. I don't ever want to live around old people. He said, I can have my buddies, I'll see my old, whatever in church. He said, but I want to be around young people too. Right? And that sort of feeling of like, you've got, Amish elders, like chasing 4-year-olds around and changing diapers and stuff too. It's just, it keeps you young,
Yes, it does.
Does that grooming mean anything to the community? Like, most of them, the guys have long beards.
Yeah, I have a small beard, yeah. The beard thing is basically, beard and no mustache goes back to doing the opposite of what the military was doing at that time. In Germany and Switzerland, a big mustache, and maybe a beard too, but especially a mustache was a symbol of militarism and machismo, all the way down to Hitler, right? Hitler had a little mustache, but if you imagine these old German generals, whatever. And so basically, a way of kind of like demonstrating your pacifism was to let your beard grow, and the Amish let it completely grow, we trim it, and then shave your upper lip. There's that. Women don't cut their hair. It's not forbidden, but they generally don't. So it can get quite long, like maybe down to their knees. Women have their heads covered, which is an injunction from the 1st to 2nd Corinthians. So it's like a woman should be, if she's praying, should have her head covered, which is traditional. You see, like, for example, older Catholic women going to church and having a veil, right? That's the same idea. And, head coverings among Jews and Muslims and so forth. That's kind of an old, it wasn't that long ago that everybody went out of the house with something on their head. A hat or a scarf or something like that. They just didn't walk out like this. That's why there are no hat companies anymore, very few hat companies.
Can't even change that.
Yes.
The teachers in the schools, where does their curriculum come from? Or?
Yeah, the curriculum is basically a blend of outside and Amish kind of generated. So things that are sort of, you have to find books that are morally appropriate, which is a challenge in some things. So things that deal with like fantasy and dragons and witches and that sort of thing, completely off limits. Harry Potter, for example, is off limits. It's something that's not permitted. But there are, they just, they're following a curriculum that, and sometimes it's what homeschoolers use, but it's basically things that other Christian school networks would use, or if it's appropriate, secular sources as well. Amish teachers, who are overwhelmingly female, are not formally trained, but it's sort of like, the business people, it's sort of the cream rises to the top. The really, really good ones are the ones that kind of go for this. And then there are networks, like support systems, so there are conventions of Amish and Mennonite teachers. There's also a really, really cool program that I'm a part of that supports, there's another group of Mennonites that lives down in Mexico, of all places, who are part of the branch of the Mennonites that came from Menno Simons in the northern Europe area. They're not ethnically related to the Amish or the Swiss Mennonites in the United States at all. They ended up very, very complicated migration history, but came basically by way of Russia, to Canada, Mexico, Paraguay, and so forth. And they have a school system that is pretty much unchanged since the 18th century, which is not a very good school system. They're very, very tradition-minded, so they've had some problems, and they say, but we're in Mexico, we don't have a really good sort of relationship with the outside, educational authorities. And so about 20 years ago, this was a kind of sort of in-reach sort of thing, like mission work, where you had Amish and Mennonite teachers from the United States and Canada going down to Mexico and training the teachers there. They used German instead of English or Spanish as their medium of instruction, but it's kind of developing things like not just simply using slates and memorizing things and having quizzes and grades and these kinds of things, which were not in the 18th century curriculum anywhere in the world. So they're kind of updating things, and then my role in this is to translate materials from English into their form of German so they can read it. And when I go to Germany, I try and gather Christian school materials, which are almost always translated from English from the United States, because the US market is so much bigger. So Amish teachers are pretty gifted in what they do. Amish 8th grade education is considered, in terms of verbal arts, at the early college level, in terms of like their reading and writing and communication skills. They're also bilingual, which helps their English. The only thing that they're not as strong in is laboratory science, because they don't have laboratory science, but they've got a lot of practical biology, geometry, and all the kinds of things that you grow up with on a farm, or as a carpenter's kid or a baker's kid.
You mentioned shunning in the beginning, have you?
Yeah, shunning is basically, it has some real sort of negative stereotypical connotations. Shunning is not like kick out of the community, you're dead to me, I'll never talk to you again. Shunning is a very, very rare form of church discipline that simply means you've done something very, very bad, like say, beat your children, beat your spouse or something like that, and not be repentant, not stop, and you're not permitted to take communion. And then there are certain symbolic things. So like, for example, a person who's shunned may not, you can't work for a shunned person and take their money. You can give them money, but you can't take money from them. So there's sort of symbolic things. So if you saw a shunned person, you would never guess they were shunned. And it's always it depends. It's typically viewed as a temporary thing to sort of demonstrate to somebody that you really need to stop beating your wife or stop beating your kids or something like that. These are very, very serious things. Now, there have been some people that have had, the shunning has been applied in some cases in not a spirit of Christian love, right? And there have been some, there are problems in every kind of community. Amish are not exempt from that. So there are some people that have left and have told some really nasty stories about leaving their community and not feeling supported and stuff. There's one very, very famous story that is often, she's Saloma Miller Furlong. She's on talk shows. I know her quite well. She grew up in a very, very conservative Amish family. Very, very dysfunctional. Very dysfunctional. Now, the family was dysfunctional because it was dysfunctional, not because it was Amish. But being Amish and very conservative didn't really help. So she left, and she left under very bitter terms. She had been baptized. You can't be shunned if you're not baptized, right? If you're not baptized, just leave, that's something else. But so she left that community and not without the intention of coming back. So she's technically always shunned. Did you have a question?
Other than being, I'm sorry.
No, that's okay.
Other than being shunned, how else are persons in that community punished if they need to be punished? Like, do they go to jail? I mean, without outside inference. So, I mean, like, if you came here as an Amish and you did something wrong, yeah, you'll go to jail. But if you live in that community, you do something.
Right. There's no sort of internal discipline system other than sort of like doing things that are immoral. So, and it's usually things like, there are levels like anything within families too, or schools like detention or something. It's basically like warning, 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 and then you need to, shunning would be applied. But it's not as nearly as dramatic as people think. The whole relationship between the Amish and law enforcement is a tricky thing, because law enforcement people actually do have weapons, right? And so Amish people are sort of torn. It's like, is it ethical for me to call the sheriff, right? Knowing that the sheriff may actually draw his weapon at some point. A lot of view it as this way. They say, well, the Amish, or the law enforcement is different from the military. The military is charged to keep the peace through violence, right? In other words, just war, okay? You're justified to do violent acts with the greater good of keeping peace. That's not what law enforcement is. Law enforcement is, as a last resort, you can use violence. But basically, you should do everything you can to keep the peace without resorting to violence. So they see kind of a difference there as far as that goes.
I was, quite a few years ago, I was in Shipshewana, and, you know, it's kind of Amish commercial. And so I was on a tour with this gentleman, and it was really interesting. But now, the way I understood it, is there a period of time for young people to leave?
Yeah, that's a rumspringa that people talk about. Rumspringa means literally running around, and boy, does that sound wild. And it fits into like the smoking and the drinking and all this other stuff. It's not that. There's this, if actually even Wikipedia's gotten it wrong. Well, I shouldn't say even, but whatever. Yeah, Wikipedia's got it wrong. It's like there's this idea that's like somehow at a certain point, young people are sent out of the community for a year to decide whether they want to join and they come back. That's not true. Basically, if you're either 16 or 17, depending on your community, you are permitted as a young person to socialize in groups without adult supervision. That's it. And what that means is, like for the vast majority of nice kids at schools, middle schools, high schools, or whatever, they're just getting together and having fun and not doing anything bad. They're drinking lemonade, not beer. They're not smoking cigarettes. They're playing volleyball. They're singing hymns, that kind of thing. There is that small sow your wild oats group, and some of them do go out, get cars, and maybe decide that they're going to come back. That's not something parents want to see their kids do.
Yeah.
There are some parents that, I mean, every parent that has a teenager experiences this. At what point do you hold back? Do you discipline? What time? How much rope, slack do you give them on the rope kind of thing? Amish parents have that same sort of thing. It's just that there are fewer Amish kids that are going to pull on that rope. But there are some that do. Because that's just how it is. Now, the way that people hear about this is that these make for better news stories. So it's like the Amish kid that was pulled over drinking and driving, or speeding, or drunk driving in a buggy, or something like that. That makes news. We laugh, right? That's the kind of thing that people hear about. I have to say, like, for example, if you were to go to a computer and to open up Google and type in Catholic priest, and what would you find? You would find not the sort of nice old father, so-and-so that, did all this wonderful work for whatever. It's not, you're going to find the bad apples, right? Which represent at most maybe 10%, right? Or something. What about the 90% of these priests that are just doing a good job? Well, it's the sort of thing, like what makes it into the newspaper, right? Good stuff comes in pretty much just in the obituary section.
I would suggest to anybody, we get a magazine at home called Our Wisconsin.
Oh, he has an Amish guy that writes for that.
There's an Amish guy that writes in there every month, and it's amazing.
Yeah.
If you really want to know what Amish life is about,
yeah,
it's really kind of cool.
I think he's a dairy farmer. Is that right? Is he a dairy farmer? Yeah. Yes, that's a very good. There's also a guy named, I can't remember his name now, an Amish guy from Ohio who writes nature essays. He's really it's kind of a philosopher of nature. David Klein, K-L-I-N-E, David Klein. He's just a very, very gifted writer. And but there are these Amish that really like to write, and they just like to sort of share these reflections of everyday life. That's a very good example of just getting a feel for what the rhythms of Amish life are from somebody that is very articulate and has a good sense of humor.
Yeah, he writes what happens during 1 week of the month.
Nice.
It's kind of interesting.
Yeah, and you can really get a sense of that family devotedness, like you were talking about, and the generational thing. It's really interesting.
Amish have a good sense of humor too. It gets a little bit earthy sometimes. It gets sort of like silly kind of, bathroom jokes sometimes, but that sort of happens in a family where everybody's kind of on top of everybody else and, waiting in line for the bathroom, that sort of thing. So the Amish just really, they enjoy being with one another. And it's just, that feeling of like always being in a community, it's not unusual for a lot of other parts of the world, Asia, Africa, in traditional societies, Native American societies, it was all about the village, the clan, right? The sort of larger community. And that's something that our mainstream society has lost quite a bit with our mobility and kind of moving away. We're disconnected. We can't, a lot of kids don't know who their great-grandparents were, what their ancestry was, you know, is it Norwegian, German, whatever it kind of is. Well, thanks so much for,
One question.
Okay.
The leaders in their community, are they ministers or they're religious leaders? I mean,
there are 3 levels of ministry. They don't say clergy because that's a little bit too high church. It says ministry. There's deacon, who don't generally preach, but are sort of basically kind of like deacons. In other words, they kind of deal with like, if their needs, you know, their medical needs, you know, fundraising, that sort of thing, organizing events. Then there's a preacher, Brady how it's called, so a minister, and then from that you could be selected, they're always chosen by lot, so you could be selected, you're nominated by the community, and then you're selected by lot, which is basically by God. Looks like random, but it's not random. And then they can become a bishop. And a bishop is the person that is the only person able to officiate at baptisms, weddings, funerals, and communion, and overseeing communion.
So about how many bishops would they have in a, whatever, is it just like one bishop for?
No, that's a great question. Basically, the Amish unit of congregation is as many people as you can fit into one house for worship. So it's about 200, and then you split. So it's called a church district. So Cashton has something like 15 church districts or something. And the ideal thing is that you have 1 bishop per district and maybe 2 preachers and 1 deacon or 1 or 2 deacons. It's very flat structure. It's not centralized. There's no synods. There are sort of like interest groups where they get together, but it's basically very decentralized. Very decentralized. Well, thanks so much for coming out this evening. I really appreciate it.